The blade falls. The sound is metallic, precise, inevitable. At the Place de la Révolution in Paris, the morning of January 1793 is cold, damp, and 20,000 people form a human circle around a wooden scaffold painted red. The man waiting up there is not a common criminal. He wore a crown. He commanded armies. His face appeared on coins, in paintings, in decrees that crossed borders. Now he stands alone, hands bound before a crowd that screams. Some cry, others laugh. Most simply watch, in silence, trying to understand what is happening. Because what is about to happen is not just the death of a man. It is the death of an idea that had existed for 1,000 years. The idea that some people are born to rule, and others to obey. The idea that power comes from God, not from the people. When the blade falls, it does not cut only a neck. It cuts the history of France in half. But what brought an entire kingdom to this point? How did one of the most powerful nations in Europe, governed by a monarchy that seemed eternal, transform itself, in less than 5 years, into a radical republic that killed its own king, reorganized the calendar, abolished official religion, and tried to remake human society from scratch? What happens to a people when all certainties collapse at the same time? When laws disappear? When street names change? When even the months of the year are reinvented? When the word citizen becomes a weapon, and the word aristocrat becomes a death sentence? What happens when revolution devours its own children? And why, 230 years later, are we still trying to understand what happened in France between 1789 and 1799? France, in 1788, was the most powerful kingdom on the European continent. 28 million people lived under the rule of King Louis XVI, a young monarch who had inherited an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Alps. Paris was the cultural capital of the Western world. French was the language of diplomacy, of philosophy, of art. The Palace of Versailles, built by Louis XIV decades earlier, remained the symbol of absolute royal power. Nobles dressed in silk and gold walked through mirrored halls while servants attended to their every need. The king's word was law. The church blessed this arrangement. And for most French people, this was simply the way the world worked. But beneath the surface of grandeur, the kingdom was fracturing. France was divided into 3 estates. The first estate was the clergy, numbering around 130,000 people, who owned 10% of all land and paid almost no taxes. The second estate was the nobility, around 400,000 individuals who controlled another 25% of the land and also enjoyed tax exemptions. The third estate was everyone else: peasants, laborers, merchants, lawyers, doctors, writers. 27 million people who bore nearly the entire tax burden of the kingdom. They paid taxes on salt, on grain, on wine. They paid feudal dues to local lords. They paid tithes to the church. And they paid royal taxes that went to fund wars, palaces, and the lifestyles of a tiny elite. For decades, this system had functioned through a combination of tradition, force, and the acceptance of inequality as divinely ordained. But by the 1780s, something had changed. Ideas were spreading. Books and pamphlets circulated in Paris cafes arguing that all men were born equal, that governments derived their power from the consent of the governed, that reason, not tradition, should guide society. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu had questioned the legitimacy of absolute monarchy and hereditary privilege. Meanwhile, France had just helped the American colonies win their independence from Britain. French soldiers returned home having seen a republic in action, a nation without a king. The contradiction became impossible to ignore. How could France support liberty abroad while maintaining oppression at home? The infrastructure of collapse was financial. By 1788, the French government was effectively bankrupt. Decades of expensive wars, including the recent support for American independence, had drained the treasury. The royal court at Versailles consumed enormous sums. Yet the king could not raise taxes on the nobility or clergy without their consent, and they refused. Every attempt at reform was blocked by those who benefited from the old system. Finance ministers came and went, each trying and failing to solve the crisis. Finally, Louis XVI made a fateful decision. He would convene the Estates General, a representative assembly that had not met since 1614, to approve new taxes. It seemed like a technicality, a procedural step, but when the Estates General gathered at Versailles in May 1789, it became clear that something far larger was happening. The Third Estate arrived with lists of grievances from across France. They demanded real representation. They demanded an end to feudal privileges. They demanded a constitution. When the king and the privileged estates tried to control the proceedings, the Third Estate broke away. On June 17th, they declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to represent the nation itself. 3 days later, locked out of their meeting hall, they gathered in a nearby tennis court and swore an oath not to disband until France had a written constitution. The king was no longer the sole source of authority. Sovereignty had shifted. Events accelerated. In July, rumors spread through Paris that the king was gathering troops to crush the assembly. On July 14th, crowds stormed the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison in the heart of the city, searching for weapons and gunpowder. The fall of the Bastille became a symbol. Royal authority had been directly challenged, and it had fallen. Within weeks, peasants across the countryside were burning feudal records, attacking manor houses, refusing to pay traditional dues. The National Assembly responded by abolishing feudalism, stripping away centuries of legal privilege in a single night session in early August. In late August, they issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, proclaiming that men are born free and equal in rights, that sovereignty resides in the nation, and that the purpose of government is to preserve liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. On paper, the old world was already gone. But dismantling an old world and building a new one are different tasks. Between 1789 and 1792, France attempted the first. A constitutional monarchy was established. The king remained, but his powers were limited. The National Assembly reorganized the entire country, abolishing ancient provinces and creating standardized departments. They restructured the tax system. They confiscated church lands to pay national debts. They attempted to make priests employees of the state. Every change created resistance. The king secretly opposed the new order. The nobility began to flee abroad, forming émigré communities that plotted counter-revolution. Many clergy refused to accept state control of the church, creating a split between constitutional and refractory priests that divided communities and families. By 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia, whose monarchs feared revolutionary ideas spreading to their own territories. Inside France, suspicion and paranoia grew. Who could be trusted? Who was secretly loyal to the old regime? In August 1792, Parisian crowds stormed the royal palace. The king was arrested. The monarchy was suspended. A new assembly, the National Convention, was elected by near-universal male suffrage, and it immediately declared France a republic. There would be no more kings. The year itself was reset. 1792 became year one. History was starting over, but the revolution radicalized further. Political factions emerged. The Girondins wanted a moderate republic respecting property and order. The Montagnards, or Mountain, wanted a more radical transformation, willing to use violence to defend the revolution from internal and external enemies. Maximilien Robespierre, a lawyer and representative from Arras, became the dominant voice arguing that virtue and terror were necessary to save the republic. When the former king was put on trial for treason in late 1792, the outcome was predetermined. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was executed. Within months, Queen Marie Antoinette followed. The revolution was now irreversible. There was no going back. What followed was the terror. From the summer of 1793 through the summer of 1794, France experienced a period of intense political repression, unprecedented in European history. The Committee of Public Safety, led by Robespierre and his allies, assumed emergency powers to defend the Republic. Revolutionary tribunals were established to try enemies of the state. The definition of enemy expanded rapidly. Nobles, priests, former officials, political moderates, anyone suspected of insufficient revolutionary zeal could be arrested, tried, and executed. The guillotine, designed ironically as a humane method of execution, became the symbol of the terror. In Paris alone, over 2,700 people were executed in just over a year. Across France, the number reached at least 17,000 official executions, with many thousands more dying in mass reprisals and civil war, particularly in regions like the Vendée that resisted revolutionary policies. Daily life became unrecognizable. The revolutionary government attempted to eliminate Christianity from public life, replacing it with the cult of reason, and later the cult of the Supreme Being. Churches were closed or converted to secular purposes. Religious holidays were abolished. The traditional calendar was replaced with a new system of 10-day weeks and months named after natural phenomena. Pluviose for rain, Thermidor for heat, Fructidor for fruit. Even timekeeping was decimalized, with days divided into 10 hours. The revolution was trying to remake human experience itself, to create not just new laws but new citizens, freed from the superstitions and prejudices of the past. But the terror consumed its own creators. Political paranoia became absolute. Danton, one of the revolution's early leaders, was executed for being too moderate. Hébert, a radical journalist, was executed for being too extreme. Robespierre himself, the architect of revolutionary virtue, eventually fell from power in July 1794 during the Thermidorian reaction. He was arrested and executed within 24 hours, alongside his closest allies. The terror ended not because it achieved its goals, but because it became unsustainable. Fear is an effective tool for destroying the old world, but it cannot build a new one. By 1795, France was exhausted. The Directory, a more conservative government, took power. The most radical phase was over, but the transformation was permanent. What emerged from the chaos of the 1790s was a France fundamentally different from the one that had existed before. The legal abolition of feudalism and hereditary privilege could not be undone. The principle that sovereignty belonged to the nation, not to a monarch, had been established even if its implementation remained contested. The metric system, revolutionary France's gift to science and commerce, began spreading across Europe. The concept of citizens with rights, rather than subjects with obligations, became embedded in political consciousness. Even when Napoleon seized power in 1799 and eventually crowned himself emperor, he could not restore the old monarchy. He ruled as a product of the revolution, not as a divine right king. The French Revolution also established templates and warnings that echoed through the next 2 centuries. It showed that radical social transformation was possible, that ordinary people could overthrow centuries-old institutions. But it also revealed the dangers of revolutionary purity, the ease with which liberation movements could become instruments of oppression, the thin line between justice and vengeance. The terror became a reference point for every subsequent revolution, a cautionary tale about what happens when political movements demand absolute loyalty and eliminate dissent in the name of virtue. Looking back from our own time, we see patterns that feel uncomfortably familiar. The polarization of political life into irreconcilable camps, the tendency to see opponents not as citizens with different views, but as enemies to be eliminated. The appeal of simplifying complex social problems into narratives of good versus evil. The promise that destroying existing institutions will automatically create something better. The French Revolution reminds us that tearing down old systems is far easier than building new ones, and that the most dangerous moment in any society is not when people recognize injustice, but when they believe they have found a perfect solution that justifies any means to achieve it. The France of the 1790s changed the world. It proved that monarchy was not inevitable, that social hierarchies could be challenged, that human societies could reinvent themselves. But it also showed the cost of that transformation. Thousands died. Families were torn apart. Communities were divided for generations. And even today, the question remains unresolved. How do we balance the need for radical change with the need for stability? How do we pursue justice without creating new forms of tyranny? These are the questions the French Revolution asked, and we're still searching for answers. I'm telling you this story because understanding how France changed forever in the 1790s means understanding the possibilities and the dangers that live inside every moment of social transformation, including our own.